Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about how to find the domain of a square root function. And this is a little bit different than finding the domain of other functions. There's kind of a process that you have to do here. But what you have to remember is if you have a negative number underneath a square root, that is going to be imaginary, okay? And so we want to avoid that at all costs. Because again, we know that the square root of -1 is going to be equal to I, meaning it's going to be imaginary. So we want to avoid that. Now, if you go back to rational functions, if you had like 9 over x, we know here that our domain is going to be all real numbers, except for x cannot be equal to 0. Because if I look at my x value here, it's in my denominator. And if I were to put in an input of 0, meaning my domain, right? So if my domain were to be 0 here, it's going to make this function undefined. So looking at a square root function, we have to eliminate all possibilities that are going to give us a negative number underneath this radical or this square root. So in other words, we want our radicand, which is this part right here, not to be a negative number. So our radicand has to be greater than or equal to 0, okay? So let me go ahead and get rid of all this here. So to find the domain of this particular function right here, you want to take your radicand, which is x plus 3, and you want to take it out from underneath that square root. So I'm going to write here x plus 3, and we talked about how we do not want this to be negative. So x plus 3 has to be greater than or equal to 0, okay? And from here, all you have to do is solve it. So when I solve it, I minus 3 on both sides, okay? This will cancel. I get x is greater than or equal to -3. And so that is your domain right there. So we can go ahead and rewrite it as d, and then we're just going to put x is greater than or equal to -3. Okay, that's done. All right, now that one was pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and try another example. And in this next example, you're going to be dealing with a quadratic underneath a square root. So here's our next example. You can see that I have a quadratic underneath my square root, but we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to take our radicand, which is x squared minus 4, and we're going to write an inequality stating that it has to be greater than or equal to 0. So taking that out, we get x squared minus 4, and this has to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, and what we want to do here is solve for x. So that means I have to add 4, right? So x squared greater than or equal to 4. And then taking the square root on both sides, I get x is greater than or equal to plus or minus 2. Okay, so you actually have two different answers here. All right, so we have to test both possibilities. So you have +2 and -2. So what you want to do at this point here is put on a number line. And we're going to put 0 right here. And then we're going to put on the two values that we came up with. And that is going to be 2 and -2. So 2 and -2. So you now have to test 3 different regions. Okay, to the left of -2, that is going to be region 1. So region 1. In between -2 and 2, that's going to be region 2. And to the left of 2, that's going to be region 3. Okay? So my first test, I'm going to pick a number to the left of -2, and I'm going to plug it into this statement, and I'm going to make sure that it does not give me a negative number. Okay? So we can just pick -3. All right, so for region 1, we're going to pick -3, and if I plug that into x, what do I get? Well, I get -3, and then squared, and then minus 4 greater than or equal to 0. This ends up giving me 9 minus 4 greater than or equal to 0, and I get 5 is greater than or equal to 0. That's true. So this region right here is going to work. Region 1, I'm going to put true. Okay? Now I'm going to test region 2. So testing region 2, I have to pick a number in between -2 and 2. I'll just pick 0. That's really easy, right? So if I plug a 0 into this x squared, I just get 0. And then I'm left with -4. I get -4 is greater than or equal to 0. And that's false, right? So this region here is false. That is not going to work. Okay? And then if I test region 3, pick a number to the right of 2, I'll just pick 3. So testing region 3, I'm going to plug in a 3. We're going to get the same answer as we did on region 1, because again, we're going to end up getting +9 here. But I'll just write it out. We're going to end up with 5 is greater than or equal to 0. And that is also going to be true. Okay? So we have our domain now. So our domain is going to be the following. And I'm going to go ahead and write it in interval notation. We're going from negative infinity to negative 2. And again, you cannot be on negative infinity, so we're going to use parentheses, okay? And then negative infinity, and we're going to negative 2, but we can be on negative 2. That would work. That would give us 0, okay? If we were to plug it into this right here, okay? So that will work. So I'm going to put negative 2, meaning we can be right on it, so a bracket, okay? And we actually have a gap in between our solution, so we need to use a union, okay? And then we move on to positive 2 going to infinity. So again, I can be on positive 2, and I'm going to positive infinity, but I cannot be on positive infinity, so I'm going to use parentheses, okay? And again, we use this union because we do have a gap, because this worked, this did not work, this did work. So this ended up being our gap right here in our solution, and we use a union to demonstrate that, okay? So this right here is going to be our final answer, okay? So I just went ahead and wrote that one in interval notation, all right? And just going back to the first problem, if you were to write the first problem in interval notation, what would that look like? I would say domain, and again, what am I doing here? I'm going from negative 3 to positive infinity. So can I be on negative 3? I can, right? Because it's equal to. So from negative 3 to positive infinity, that's how this one would look in interval notation, all right? But again, you could also write it as an inequality like I did here. Either way is fine. All right, let's try one more example. Okay, so here's our last example. We have another quadratic underneath a square root. So we're going to take that radicand, which is negative x squared plus 9, and we're going to create an inequality stating that this has to be greater than or equal to 0. From here, all we have to do is solve. So here I'm going to get negative x squared, and then I get greater than or equal to negative 9. I'm going to end up dividing by a negative 1 here. So dividing by a negative 1. Okay, so technically, right, I still have my inequality here. That's going to flip it, but it's not actually going to matter, okay? The reason we're solving this right now is so we can determine what regions we need to test. And when we plug it back in, we're going to use the original right here. So technically, you could actually replace this inequality with an equal sign at this point. I just left it as an inequality. Just keep that in mind. It doesn't matter if I flip it here or not because it's the original right here that I'm going to be plugging it into to test, okay? So just keep that in mind, but hey, we'll go ahead and flip it anyways. I'll put x squared, we'll flip it, and then I get positive 9, and then I have to take the square root on both sides. I get x, and then I get less than or equal to plus or minus 3. Okay, so this is what we're really after right here, this plus or minus 3. That tells me the region I'm going to be testing, all right? So on my number line, I'm going to put on negative 3 and positive 3. So I'm going to start at 0. We'll put negative 3 right here and positive 3 here. So my first test, my first region is right here. And then my second region is in between negative 3 and 3. And then my third region is to the right of positive 3. So I'm going to pick a number to the left of negative 3. I'll just pick negative 4. And again, I'm plugging that into the original right here. Okay? So I'm going to pick negative 4. So I'm going to put 1. And plugging in a negative 4. Now be careful here. That negative is going to stay on the outside. And then in parentheses, you're going to put what you picked. In this case here, it's going to be negative 4. So negative 4 squared plus 9. And then greater than or equal to 0. Okay? So when I do this out, negative 4 squared is 16, but then I have a negative on the outside, so it becomes negative 16. So I get negative 16 plus 9 greater than or equal to 0, and I can already tell that this is not going to work. I'm going to end up with negative 7 greater than or equal to 0. That is false. That does not work. So region 1, that is false. Okay? Let's try region 2. Now the easy value to pick here would be 0. All right? So if I plug a 0 into negative x squared, this whole part just becomes 0 and I'm left with 9. So region 2, if I were to pick 0, I'm going to be left with 9 greater than or equal to 0. That is true. So region 2 was true. Okay? And then testing region 3, let's pick positive 4. So region 3, we're going to pick positive 4. So I put a negative here, and then I have my positive 4, and then squared, and then plus 9. greater than or equal to 0. So you're actually going to get the same exact answer as you did on number 1. I'll get positive 16 here, but then I have a negative on the outside. So I'm left with negative 16 plus 9. I get a negative 7 again. So negative 7 greater than or equal to 0. So that is also false. So I put false here, meaning only region 2 worked out. So my solution here is going to be the following. It's going to be negative 3 to 3. So we can go ahead and put that in interval notation. Okay, that's going to be negative 3 to 3. And notice how I'm using brackets here because I can be on those values. And again, you can test it out. If I take a negative 3 and plug it into x, well, the whole left-hand side will be 0, and that's fine. I'll have 0 is greater than or equal to 0. That would work. So again, that's totally fine, meaning we're right on those values. And so you could also write it as an inequality. You could say domain, and then you could say negative 3 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 3. That is the same exact thing. So either way is fine. It doesn't matter how you do it. Okay, but there's the domain. All right, 2 different variations of writing it. So that is how you find the domain of square root functions. It's pretty straightforward. But if you end up having a quadratic underneath the square root like we did here and in the previous example, you have to create a number line and then set up your test regions and then go from there. So that's pretty much it. I hope that you gained something from the video. I hope that you learned something. If the video did in fact help you, if you could just go ahead and give it a thumbs up, that would be greatly appreciated. Also, make sure you subscribe to this channel. That way you get more math videos in the future, and I'll see you in the next one.